Okay, stop scrolling for a second. You've probably eaten bread this week, maybe today, maybe an hour ago. It's the most boring food in your kitchen. Nobody posts a picture of toast. But here's the thing. The story of how humans figured out bread might be one of the strangest accidents in our entire species history. Not a clever invention, an accident. A weird, messy, thousands of years long accident that quietly rearranged everything that came after it. Farming, cities, writing, religion, empires, all of it. Tangled up with a handful of ground up grass. Tonight we go back further than you think. Way further. Before farms, before villages, before anyone had ever planted a seed on purpose. And we're going to find out that bread might not be something farming gave us. Bread might be the reason farming happened at all. Stick with me, this one gets genuinely strange. Let's set the scene. Around 14,000 years ago, before agriculture existed anywhere on Earth, there was a group of hunter-gatherers living near what's now northeastern Jordan. Archaeologists call this culture the Natufian, not farmers, hunters, forage, people who followed food instead of growing it. And in 2018, a team of researchers digging at a site called Shubeika, one found something that shouldn't have been there. Tiny, charred crumb, burnt flecks sitting inside a stone fire. At first, nobody thought much of it, just fire debris, until they looked closer under a microscope. Those crumbs weren't random burnt plant matter. They had structure, air pocket, a texture that only forms one way. They were bread, actual bread, made from wild wheat and barley, ground down, mixed with water, and cooked on hot stone or ash, 4,000 years before farming existed anywhere on the planet. Let that sit for a second. We used to assume the order of operations was simple. Humans settle down, humans plant crops. Humans eventually figure out bread as a nice bonus. Grow the wheat first, invent the sandwich later. Straightforward story. Except the crumbs at Shubeika, one blow that story up completely. These people weren't farming. They were wandering the landscape, gathering wild grass seeds by hand, one stalk at a time, from plants nobody had domesticated yet. And they were already grinding those seeds into flour and baking something recognizably bread-shaped, thousands of years before anyone thought to plant a single seed on purpose. So here's the wild theory some archaeologists now take seriously. What if bread came first? What if the demand for wild wheat and barley got so intense, so central to daily life, that people eventually thought, why are we walking miles to find stuff? Why don't we just keep it close? Plant it near camp. Control it. In other words, bread might not be a product of the agricultural revolution. Bread might be one of the reasons the agricultural revolution happened in the first place. A craving that rearranged human civilization. You ever want something so specific you'll reorganize your whole week around getting it? Imagine reorganizing your entire species around it instead. Now, before we go further, let's actually talk about what making bread meant for people with no ovens, no yeast packets, and absolutely no idea what gluten was. Because the process was brutal. First, you had to gather wild grass seeds. Einkorn wheat, emmer wheat, wild barley, tiny seeds growing on stalks scattered across open land, nowhere near as plump or convenient as the wheat we grow today. You'd need to collect enormous quantities just to end up with a usable amount of flour. This wasn't a quick trip to the pantry. This was hours, sometimes days, of repetitive physical labor. Then came the grinding. And this is where it gets genuinely rough. Ancient people used what archaeologists call quern, flat stone slabs paired with a smaller handheld stone used to crush grain into flour through pure, repetitive force. Push, grind, scrape, repeat for hours, every single day, in many communities, for most of a person's adult life. Here's a detail that always gets people. Archaeologists studying Natufian and later Neolithic skeletons have found consistent wear patterns in the bone. Arthritis in the knees, deformities in the toes, from kneeling for hours at a grinding stone, stress damage in the lower back and shoulders. Grinding grain wasn't a chore. It was closer to a full-time manual labor job, and it left permanent marks on the human body. So next time a recipe tells you to knead dough for 10 minutes and you feel a little tired, remember, somewhere an actual ancient human is looking at you through the fabric of time, unimpressed. Once you had flour, you mixed it with water. That's it. No yeast. No salt, most of the time. Just crushed grain and water, forming a rough paste. Then you cooked it directly on a hot stone, or pressed it against the inside wall of a heated pit, or laid it in the ashes near a fire. The result would have been dense, flat, and honestly probably not delicious by modern standards, but it was bread. Real bread. The ancestor of every loaf, roll, and flatbread that came after it. And here's where the story takes its first genuine twist. At some point, someone left dough out too long. Maybe it sat overnight. Maybe it got rained on and left in a warm corner of a hut. And instead of staying a flat, dense paste, it started to change. It puffed. It bubbled. It smelled different, sharper, almost sour. Wild yeast floating invisibly in the air all around us, all the time had landed in that dough and started eating the sugars in the flour, releasing gas as a byproduct. Nobody understood fermentation. Nobody had ever heard the word yeast, but somebody, somewhere, tasted that strange bubbling dough anyway. And it was better, lighter, softer, genuinely improved by what looked to them like the dough going bad. This is one of my favorite details in all of ancient food history. The most important upgrade in bread's entire existence wasn't designed. It was discovered by accident, by someone brave or hungry enough to eat dough that looked wrong. Somewhere out there is the single most influential mistake in culinary history, and we don't even know who made it. Now let's fast forward to a civilization that took this accident and turned it into an entire economy. Egypt. By around 3000 BCE, Egyptians weren't just baking bread. They were mass-producing it, on a scale that's honestly hard to picture. Bread wasn't just food in ancient Egypt, it was currency, it was wages, it was, quite literally, how the pyramids got built. Here's something that surprises people every time. The workers who built the pyramids at Giza weren't slaves dragged in chains, despite what pop culture loves to imply. Archaeological evidence points to organized labor crews, paid workers, fed daily rations that included, you guessed it, bread and beer. Massive amounts of both. Entire bakeries and breweries have been excavated near the pyramid worker villages, built specifically to keep thousands of laborers fed. And bread and beer in ancient Egypt came from almost the exact same starting point: ground grain, water, and fermentation. Some historians believe early beer may have literally started as loaves of bread, deliberately made extra fermented, then crumbled into water and left to continue fermenting into a thick, nutritious, mildly alcoholic drink. Bread and beer, born from the same dough, split into two different destinies. Egyptian tomb paintings, thousands of years old, show bakers at work in incredible detail, kneading dough with their feet, shaping loaves into dozens of forms, some triangular, some round, some shaped like animal, or even human figures, likely used in religious offerings. Egyptologists have identified over 40 distinct bread shapes just from tomb art. 40. This wasn't a side dish. This was a national obsession with genuine craftsmanship behind it. Egyptians also figured out something crucial almost by accident. The same way that first sourdough discovery happened. If you kept a piece of old fermented dough around and mixed it into your next batch, the new dough would rise faster and more reliably. Essentially, they'd invented a sourdough starter, a living culture of wild yeast, passed along and reused for generation after generation, decades before anyone understood what yeast actually was. Some of the wild yeast strains found in modern Egyptian bakeries today are believed by researchers to be genetically linked to strains that have been cultivated continuously for thousands of years. Read that again. There is a real possibility that the wild yeast living in bread being baked in Cairo right now shares ancestry with yeast cultivated during the age of the pharaoh. That's not folklore. That's an unbroken biological thread running through 4,000 years of human history, hiding in something as ordinary as a loaf of bread. And just like the story we've seen play out in other parts of ancient history, bread quality in Egypt tracked social class almost perfectly. Wealthy Egyptians ate fine white bread, made from carefully sifted flour with the coarse bran removed. Laborers and the poor ate dense, dark, gritty bread, full of husk fragments and, honestly, often full of actual sand and grit from the grinding stones themselves. Archaeologists studying Egyptian mummies have found something genuinely unpleasant as a result: severely worn down teeth across huge portions of the population, caused by decades of chewing bread packed with stone particles. Bread built the pyramids. Bread also wore down the teeth of the people who built them. History rarely hands out its rewards evenly. Let's head east to Mesopotamia, sometimes called the cradle of civilization, and for good reason. This is where some of the very first writing on Earth developed, and unsurprisingly, some of that writing is about grain. Sumerian clay tablets, some of the oldest written records in human history, include detailed grain rationing lists, literal receipts, tracking how much barley and wheat was owed to temple workers, soldiers, and laborers, paid out largely in the form of bread and beer. Bread wasn't just food here either, it was bureaucracy, it was payroll. Some of humanity's very first written numbers exist specifically because someone needed to track how many loaves were owed to whom. Mesopotamian bakers used clay ovens shaped like tall, narrow domes, called tanners, a design so effective it's still used across parts of the Middle East and South Asia today, essentially unchanged for thousands of years. You press flattened dough directly against the scorching interior wall, wall, and it cooks fast, crisp on the outside, soft within. If you've ever eaten fresh naan from a clay oven, you've experienced a cooking method that predates written language. And once again, that familiar pattern shows up. Grain quality mapped directly onto social hierarchy. Temple records show fine wheat bread reserved for priests, officials, and the elite, while barley bread, considered rougher and less prestigious, fed laborers and the poor. Even the gods, according to temple offering records, were given only the finest bread. Apparently divine standards were high, even 4,000 years ago. Now let's jump to Greece and Rome, because this is where bread stopped being just food and started becoming outright political. In ancient Greece, bread was deeply tied to identity and status. Wheat bread was considered civilized, refined, genuinely Greek. Barley bread, meanwhile, carried a certain stigma, associated with the poor, with soldiers on campaign rations, sometimes even used symbolically as a mild punishment or humiliation in certain rituals. Imagine a food so socially loaded that serving someone the wrong type of bread was basically an insult. Rome took this obsession and scaled it up into something enormous. By the height of the Roman Empire, the city of Rome had over 300 professional bakeries. Baking had become a legitimate, respected trade, complete with formal guilds, apprenticeships, and even inherited family businesses passed down for generations. And then Pompeii happened, and accidentally handed archaeologists one of the greatest gifts in food history. When Mount Vesuvius erupted in 79 CE, it buried the city instantly, preserving an incredible amount of daily life exactly as it stood. Inside one bakery, archaeologists found carbonized loaves of bread still sitting in the oven, essentially frozen in time. You can actually see photographs of these loaves today, round, scored into segments for easy breaking, almost exactly like a modern balle you'd buy from a bakery right now. 2,000 years and the basic shape of an everyday loaf of bread has barely changed. That's either deeply comforting or slightly unsettling, depending on how you look at it. Rome also introduced something genuinely important, and honestly kind of ahead of its time, a form of organized food welfare. Roman law, particularly under what's known as the annona system, guaranteed, subsidized, or entirely free grain and bread distribution to Roman citizens, especially the poor. This wasn't charity in the modern sense. It was official state policy, a calculated way to maintain stability and keep the population fed and frankly kept from rioting. You've probably heard the old Roman phrase, bread and circuses, usually said with a bit of a sneer, implying the public was distracted and pacified with free food and entertainment instead of real political power. And sure, there's real cynicism baked into that phrase, but there's also something genuinely significant hiding underneath it. An empire that large, running an organized program to keep its population fed with bread, was operating on a scale of food logistics the ancient world had never really attempted before. Politically manipulative? Almost certain. Also a genuinely early form of large-scale public food security? Also true. History rarely lets you pick just one interpretation. Before we leave Europe, let's jump forward a bit into medieval time, because bread got weirdly bureaucratic here too, in ways that still echo today. In medieval England, bread was considered so essential to public order that the government passed an actual law regulating it called the Assize of Bread and Ale, established sometime in the 1200s. This law fixed the price of bread based directly on the price of grain, and set strict rules about weight and quality. If a baker was caught cheating customers by shorting the weight of a loaf, punishments ranged from fines to public humiliation in the stock. Some records even describe bakers being dragged through town streets tied to a hurdle, loaf strapped to their chest, as a public warning to others. Bread fraud was apparently such a common temptation that some bakers started adding a little extra to every dozen loaves sold, just to guarantee they weren't caught shortchanging anyone. That extra loaf became known as the baker's dozen, 13 instead of 12. You've heard that phrase your entire life. Now you know it exists because of medieval anti-fraud law. And once again, that same pattern from every other civilization shows up right on schedule. Wealthy medieval households ate finely milled white bread called manchet, soft, pale, and expensive to produce because it required extensively sifted flour. Peasants and laborers ate dense, dark bread made from rye, barley, or whatever coarse grain was locally available, often mixed with beans or even acorns during lean years to stretch the flour supply further. Bread, once again, functioning as a visible marker of exactly where you stood in society, readable at a glance, loaf by loaf. There's one more detail from this era that genuinely surprises people. In medieval households, thick, stale slices of bread called trenchers were often used as edible plate. Food was served directly on top of the bread, which soaked up the juices and sauces throughout the meal. Once dinner was finished, the trencher itself might be eaten, or in wealthier households, given away to servants or the poor waiting outside. An entire course of the meal, quietly functioning as both dinnerware and dessert. Let's take a quick detour east to China, because bread's story looks completely different once you leave the wheat-heavy regions of the Mediterranean and Middle East. Much of ancient China's staple diet centered on rice rather than wheat, especially in the south, where the climate favored it. But in northern China, wheat did take hold, and it developed in a genuinely distinct direction. Instead of baking bread in an oven, northern Chinese cooks largely turned to steaming. This is where mantou comes in, a soft, pillowy steamed bun that's still eaten across China today. According to traditional accounts, the technique dates back roughly 2,000 years, developing independently from Middle Eastern and European baking traditions almost entirely. No shared influence, no cultural borrowing, just two completely separate civilizations independently discovering that ground wheat and a little fermentation could make something soft and satisfying using two entirely different cooking methods. Chinese culinary tradition eventually built on this into noodles, dumplings, and an enormous range of wheat-based food, running in a completely different direction from the crusty ovens of Rome and Egypt. Same basic ingredient, wildly different outcome, which honestly says a lot about how human creativity works when you leave people alone with a problem and just enough time. Now let's cross an ocean, because here's where bread's story gets genuinely complicated, and honestly, where a lot of ancient food history gets flattened in a way that isn't fair. In the Americas, wheat wasn't part of the picture at all before European contact. No wheat bread, no barley, none of the grains we've been talking about this entire video. Instead, indigenous cultures across the Americas built their own version of this story around an entirely different plant, maize, what we now call corn. Ancient Mesoamerican cultures, including the Maya and later the Aztec, ground dried corn kernels using stone tools remarkably similar in basic function to Old World grinding stones, despite having zero contact with those civilizations. This ground corn became the foundation for tortillas, tamales, and a wide range of maize-based flatbreads cooked on hot clay or stone surfaces called comals, functioning almost exactly like the flat baking stones used across Mesopotamia and Egypt. Here's the part that genuinely deserves more recognition. Aztec culture developed a technique called nixtamalization, treating corn kernels with an alkaline solution, often made using ash or lime, before grinding. This process wasn't just about taste or texture, it dramatically increased the nutritional value of the corn, unlocking niacin and essential amino acids that would otherwise remain nutritionally inaccessible to the human body. This matters more than it might sound like at first. Later, when corn was exported to parts of Europe and Africa without the accompanying knowledge of nixtamalization, entire populations that adopted corn as a staple crop without this treatment developed severe nutritional deficiencies, including a disease called pellagra. Indigenous Mesoamerican cultures had solved this problem quietly and effectively, centuries before European contact, using nothing but careful observation and generations of accumulated food knowledge. That's not a footnote. That's independently developed food science, running in parallel with everything happening across Egypt, Mesopotamia, and Rome without a shred of shared contact or influence. Let's swing over to Africa for a moment too, because this region rarely gets its due in these conversations, and it absolutely should. In the highlands of ancient Ethiopia, communities domesticated a tiny, nutrient-dense grain called teff and used it to create injera, a naturally fermented, spongy flatbread still central to Ethiopian and Eritrean cuisine today. Injera relies on wild yeast fermentation, developing that same sour, complex flavor we saw show up independently in Egyptian sourdough, again with no shared connection between the two traditions. Different continents, different grain, different climates, and yet, again and again, human beings kept independently arriving at the exact same basic idea. Grind a grain, add water, let wild yeast do something slightly mysterious to it, and cook it on a hot surface. It's almost like fermentation was just sitting there in the environment, waiting patiently for someone, an edge, anywhere, to notice it. Let's pause here for a second and actually talk about the chemistry, because it's honestly more fascinating than most people expect. Wild yeast exists basically everywhere around us, floating in the air, resting on grain husks, living on the surfaces of fruit. When you mix flour and water and leave it out, you're essentially inviting these invisible organisms to a buffet. They start consuming the natural sugars present in the flour, and as they eat, they release carbon dioxide gas as a waste product. That gas gets trapped inside the sticky protein network in the dough, called gluten, and it's this trapped gas that makes bread rot, creating all those little air pockets you see when you tear open a fresh loaf. Ancient bakers had absolutely no concept of microorganisms, no idea gas was even involved. All they knew was, If you let dough sit around for a while before cooking it, it turned into something better, lighter, softer, more satisfying. That's not primitive thinking. That's applied science without the vocabulary. Careful trial and error, repeated across countless households and countless generations, eventually encoding real biochemical knowledge into daily practice, purely through observation. No laboratories required. Now here's something that ties this whole story together in a way I genuinely love. Bread didn't just feed people, it became deeply woven into how ancient civilizations understood the sacred, the divine, and their place in the universe. In ancient Egypt, bread was regularly left as an offering in tombs, meant to sustain the spirit of the deceased in the afterlife. Archaeologists have found genuine loaves of bread, thousands of years old, still sitting inside burial chambers, placed there with the explicit belief that the dead would need real sustenance on their journey beyond life. In Mesopotamian religion, bread was formally offered to temple gods as part of structured religious ritual, treated as food fit for divine being, not just mortal. In ancient Judaism, unleavened bread became central to Passover, deliberately made without fermentation to commemorate the hurried escape from slavery in Egypt, a story where there wasn't even time to let dough rise. In early Christianity, bread became the literal centerpiece of communion, transformed into one of the most powerful religious symbols in the entire faith. And across an enormous range of cultures and languages, the simple act of sharing bread with someone became shorthand for trust, hospitality, and peace. We still say it today. Breaking bread with someone. Think about that phrase for a second. It survived essentially unchanged in meaning across thousands of years and dozens of civilizations, because bread has always represented something bigger than mere calories. Shared labor, shared resource, shared trust, baked directly into a shared meal. Let's bring this back around because we started this video with an accident, and I want to leave you with an even bigger one. Everything we've walked through tonight, wild grass seeds ground by hand near a fire 14,000 years ago, dough forgotten just long enough to start bubbling, sourdough starters passed down for generations without anyone understanding why they worked, pyramids quite literally built on rations of bread and beer, entire religious traditions built around the symbolism of a shared loaf. All of it traces back to one single, staggeringly simple realization. Grind a seed, add water, cook it, and if you're patient, or lucky, or simply forget about it for a little while, something genuinely remarkable happens to it entirely on its own. Humans didn't invent yeast. We didn't create fermentation from nothing. We just paid close enough attention to notice it happening, again and again in kitchens and camps and clay ovens scattered across nearly every corner of the inhabited world. Completely independent of one another. Egypt discovered it. Mesopotamia discovered it. Ethiopia discovered it. Entirely separate civilizations, entirely separate grains, arriving at the same basic biochemical trick purely through patient trial and error, over and over again. That's not a coincidence. That's just how curious a species we've always been. So next time you're holding a sandwich or tearing into a warm dinner roll or scraping the very last crumbs of toast off a plate, take half a second to actually think about what you're holding. It's not just food. It's the end result of 14,000 years of humans grinding stone against grain, forgetting dough in the right place at the right moment, and quietly passing down knowledge they couldn't fully explain, but somehow always understood was worth keeping. Bread might genuinely be the oldest continuous experiment in human history, and somehow it's still sitting right there on your kitchen counter, completely unbothered by any of this, waiting for you to finally take a bite.